Listen, is forgiveness the doormat experience of all time where your enemy gets away with slapping you in the face? We sometimes feel like the forgiveness we give minimizes the reality of the crime, almost like we're saying, it doesn't matter. So is forgiving actually a form of enabling? They may be two of the most gripping crime story books ever written. And the irony is that both of them were penned by a 20-year-old mountain mama girl named Joy Swift. She tells her wrenching personal story in the Christian bestseller, They're All Dead, Aren't They? A few years later, she retold the story in a more secular style for a broader audience. That book was entitled A Cry for Justice. Well, in a nutshell, Joy was only 15 years old when she married an older man named George and inherited his 3 kids. The teen bride immediately had 2 baby girls of her own, and so she was soon playing house, so to speak, in a blended family of 7. George's oldest daughter, Stephanie, was just 2 years younger than Joy was, but she managed to be a good stepmom, a maternal authority figure to the girl and the other 4 kids in the house. And then one September night in 1977, while she and George were out at an American Legion community bingo game, there was the sound of police sirens. They drove home to find the hillside bathed in the flashing red strobe lights of police cars and the yellow tape marking out a quadruple homicide. All 4 of the younger kids had been shot dead, butchered, right there in her house. The entire state of Missouri called it the crime of the century. And it stunned that Lake Ozark community when the killer turned out to be none other than the 14-year-old neighbor's kid, Billy Dyer. For some crazy reason, he'd just gone nuts, employing a slow-witted 22-year-old friend named Ray to help him as he slipped over to the Swift home and mowed down the 2 boys and 2 infant baby daughters, Stacy and Tanya. Well, the story is powerfully told about how this young mother, just 20 years old, had to cope with her grief and her anger. Being a mom was her life. It was everything to her, George, and their kids. And just like that, the kids were gone. The ongoing rage she felt towards the 2 guilty murderers was a huge demon inside of her. And in the pages of these 2 books, she writes openly about her hatred, her thirst for revenge. As much as I wanted justice, I really didn't want the killer and his accomplice to get the death penalty. My reasoning behind this confused even me, since at the police station I would have gladly killed them, given a chance. Now I wasn't sure. And Joy Swift went on through a kind of religious experience during this time, so concepts of God and forgiveness began to get thrown at her, but she couldn't cope with it all very well. Someday they would stand before God, she continues. But for now, I wanted them to suffer and feel pain. I wanted them to experience a living hell on earth. I wanted them to know fear in prison, fear without escape, like my kids had felt. I wanted no mercy, for they had shown none. I lay in bed at night wondering what they were doing in their jail cells. I dreamed up ways to get in to see them. Give me 5 minutes alone, I would say. Warden, I just want to talk to them. And this fantasy, this almost bloodthirsting dream, was one she played over and over and over again in her mind. Daytime, nighttime. She kept this picture of getting even in her mind 24 hours a day. When the guard was out of sight, I'd pull a long, heavy chain out from under my shirt. I'd whip them mercilessly as they cowered against the bunks. I'd make them beg the way Tanya begged. But I wouldn't stop. I envisioned gangs of prisoners surrounding them and no one hearing their cries. I wanted them thrown into a dark, windowless cell. I never wanted them to see the sunshine again. But I didn't want them dead. Not yet. And this pattern was her life for years. In fact, it was more than her life. It was her life. It was her identifying trait. Joy Swift was the avenging angel. There wasn't much else she was. She and her husband George were hell-bent on getting even with Billy Dyer and Ray Richardson. Her whole existence was consumed with an oxymoron: what to do about loving hatred. Well, this is where Joy quickly found herself. She reveled in and wallowed in her feelings of anger. She treated herself to her wounded sentiments, her hurt. She enjoyed playing out the vision in her mind, that chain and the endless whipping of a screaming Billy Dyer. Over and over the screams, the getting even. That bitter image became a sweet dream for her. And in 1,000 ways, hopefully smaller ones, but really, all hatred is poison, isn't it? You and I have some form of this to resolve. We love to hate. Have you ever been in a dynamic where you really did not like a certain person? For whatever reason? And maybe you had good reason not to. Your cause was just. And perhaps you soon found another person who felt the same way. Now you were really in business. The two of you could swap stupidity stories, exchange anecdotes, play endless rounds of, "Can you top this?" Were you enjoying your resentment? The ongoing recycle program of trading your hatred back and forth? Yes, in a wrong kind of way, you did enjoy it. But as one philosopher once observed, a good friendship cannot be based just on having a common enemy. You hate Mr. X, and I hate Mr. X, and therein lies our friendship. That's not really going to last very long. An old book of quotations brought this one to the surface by the ancient writer Juvenal. Revenge is sweeter than life itself. Isn't that true? You know, I've certainly had periods in my life when I believed it was. It was so sweet to play with revenge and plan it and plot it and hopefully experience it. But examine for yourself the entire quote. Revenge is sweeter than life itself. So think fools. And that's really the truth in the end. Anger is such a delicious thing, but it's not a lasting sweetness. It turns on its eater and destroys the person who hates. You know, in both Psalms and Proverbs, the Lord gives us this plain truth in Psalm 37, verse 8. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Again, listen, there's nothing sinful about some kinds of anger. God's word wouldn't instruct us to be slow to anger unless there were times when it would be appropriate to get to the point of anger. Any Christian who didn't get angry about what happened there in Columbine High School or Lake Ozark would have a problem with their spiritual thermometer. But when we have anger, listen, it needs to be the right kind of anger, and we need to be slow getting there. Also, once we get there, we need to have a spiritual way to get away from anger. Stay tuned for the rest of the story of Joy Swift.